I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth: peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time.
On June 10th, 1963, in the middle of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and only 8 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, President John F. Kennedy delivered a speech on the subject of peace. That speech, less than 30 minutes in length, helped lower the risks of nuclear war with the Soviet Union and opened the way to important treaties on atomic testing and future treaties on arms control. Tragically, in the decades since, the United States has been engaged in multiple wars and countless other military actions of various degrees across the world. The goal of promoting peace seems today elusive. Since the attacks of September the 11th, 2001, the United States has been at war not only in Iraq and Afghanistan, but in other nations as well. The so-called global war on terror has no apparent end in sight, as warfare has spread throughout the Middle East as well as many countries in Africa. Innocent civilians have died by the hundreds of thousands in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the U.S. seems to be only creating more enemies as time goes on. Meanwhile, the United States is on the verge of restarting the Cold War with Russia, including a new nuclear arms race, and military competition and friction between the United States and China have the potential to escalate into something worse. Conflict with North Korea and Iran present the risks of war, including even nuclear war. The U.S. defense budget has reached record levels of over $700 billion a year. And U.S. arms sales, as well as U.S.-based mercenaries calling themselves private security companies, spread across the globe at levels never before seen. The words of President Kennedy from 1963 are as relevant today as they were when first delivered. It is our purpose in this film to provide an overview of an ongoing project to promote the concept of peace building, turning away from the mindset that violence and warfare are inevitable and unavoidable. Join us with open minds and open hearts in this endeavor. It is time for a new way of thinking, one that does not glorify war and one that recognizes that international conflict can and must be resolved without violence. Peace is possible, practical, and necessary. In late 2001, the United States invaded Afghanistan because that's where Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda were hiding. In March 2003, the United States also invaded Iraq because it supposedly had weapons of mass destruction and supported terrorism. It turns out there were no weapons of mass destruction, and there was no link between Iraq and the 9/11 attacks. Meanwhile, since 9/11, what have been the costs of those wars? What have we learned as a nation? As reported by Brown University's Cost of War Project, more than 2.7 million U.S. service members have been to the war zones in Iraq and Afghanistan since 2001, and over half of them have deployed more than once. Many times that numbers of Americans have borne the costs of war as spouses, parents, children and friends who cope with their loved one's absence, mourn their deaths, or greet the changed person who often returns. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and contractors have been wounded and are living with disabilities and war-related illnesses. So far, about 1 million U.S. veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars have filed disability claims with the VA. And based on the experience of the Vietnam War generation, that number is expected to continue to grow in future years and decades. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have been more difficult for military families than past wars, with more frequent deployments and shorter periods at home. In comparison to the civilian population, Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans are facing elevated rates of suicide and mental illness, drug and alcohol dependence, car crashes, and homelessness. They and their families also experience higher rates of divorce as well. When service members return home injured, it is often their families who provide care, even when veterans are housed in military hospitals. The offloading of care for the war wounded onto families and community organizations should be counted among the costs of war. Now, the Cost of War Project has documented that despite the erroneous belief that modern war spares civilian life, the vast majority of people killed are Afghan, Pakistani, and Iraqi civilians. Over 200,000 civilians have been killed in the fighting. People living in the war zones have been killed in their homes, in markets, and on roadways. They have been killed by bombs, bullets, fire, improvised explosive devices, and drones. Civilians die at checkpoints as they are run off the road by military vehicles, when they step on a mine or cluster bomb, as they collect wood or tend to their fields, and when they are kidnapped and executed for purposes of revenge or intimidation. They are killed by the United States, by its allies, by insurgents and sectarians in the civil wars spawned by the invasions. Many times more Iraqis, Afghans, and Pakistanis have died as a result of battered infrastructure and poor health conditions arising from the war than directly from its violence. War refugees often lose access to a stable food supply and to their jobs, resulting in increased malnutrition and vulnerability to disease. The wars take a long-term toll on civilians and their livelihoods, including the effects of war death and injury on survivors and their families. Millions of people living in the war zones have also been displaced by war. To date, 10.1 million Afghans, Pakistanis, and Iraqis are living as war refugees in other countries or are displaced from their homes. The insecurity that Iraqis, Afghans, and Pakistanis face extends far beyond the guns and blasts of war. It includes lack of secure access to food, health care, housing, employment, and clean water and sanitation, as well as the loss of community. According to Brown University's Cost of War Project, as far as economic cost, the United States federal government has spent or obligated $4.8 trillion on the wars in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. This figure includes direct congressional war appropriations, war-related increases to the Pentagon base budget, veterans care and disability, increases to the Homeland Security budget, interest payments on direct war borrowing, foreign assistance spending, and estimated future obligations for veterans care. This total omits many other expenses, such as the macroeconomic costs to the U.S. economy, the opportunity costs of not investing war dollars in alternative sectors, future interest on war borrowing, and local government and private war costs. The current wars have been paid for almost entirely by borrowing. This borrowing has raised the U.S. budget deficit, increased the national debt, and had other macroeconomic effects, such as raising consumer interest rates, among others. Unless the U.S. immediately repays money borrowed for the war, there will also be future interest payments. Brown University's Cost of War project estimates that interest payments could total over $7.9 trillion by 2053, 50 years after the Iraq invasion.
Well, I think that partly because in the English language the words million, billion, and trillion all rhyme, it's very difficult to get your mind around how big $1 trillion is. So I usually tell my students that if you had a stack of $1,000 bills that was $1 million, it would be about 4 inches high. If you have $1 billion, it's about 350 feet, which is like approaching Washington Monument size. And $1 trillion is 63 miles. So the order of magnitude is so different. And I think it's very difficult for people to keep in mind that we're talking about trillions of dollars spent on these wars. Because every day people see millions of dollars for this, billions of dollars for this, trillions of dollars for the economy. It's kind of an overwhelming sense. But yes, people know that the war is costing a lot. And one of the reasons that we wrote the $3 trillion war when we did was that we felt that there was a sense that, yeah, the war is costing a lot, but we were trying to put a price tag on it, what a lot meant, and that has grown. But I still think that it's very difficult for most people to even fathom how much money we've spent on these wars.
Spending on the wars has involved opportunity cost for the U.S. economy. Although military spending does produce jobs, spending in other areas such as healthcare could produce more jobs. Additionally, while investment in military infrastructure grew, investment in other non-military public infrastructure, such as roads and schools, did not grow at the same rate. And finally, federal war costs exclude billions of dollars of state, municipal, and private war costs across the country, dollars spent on services for returned veterans and their families, in addition to local homeland security efforts. The United States could have pursued several non-military alternatives to holding accountable those responsible for perpetrating the 9/11 attacks, just as the United States and other Western nations did historically in responding to terrorism for decades before 9/11.
Well, right after the 9/11 attacks, in fact, during that day, I was very aware that the reaction would probably be to go to war. And from that day to the present, I'm convinced that we didn't weigh the options the way that we should have. One option obviously was to go to war against whoever made the attack, but another option would be to try to use the mechanisms of international law and to treat a terrorist attack as a crime, which it is. And that would mean going after the perpetrators using the mechanisms of international law, international criminal law. And that would then have avoided many of the consequences that have nothing to do with the actual perpetrators of the attack.
Terrorism cannot be expunged. What we ought to have done is to condemn the 9/11 attacks in the strongest possible language as a great crime, and then rallied other nations to join us in an effort to eliminate this criminal enterprise. We should have likened it to the mafia, a criminal enterprise of international scope, but one where the proper response was not invading and occupying countries, but mobilizing international police forces for a sustained effort to bring these criminals to justice.
Terrorism is nothing new, but the U.S.'s massive military response has been extremely costly and counterproductive by starting a cycle of perpetual war, expanding to any country in which terrorists might live, even when they are not a direct threat to the United States. These alternatives would have been far less costly in human lives. For example, the U.S. invasion of Iraq created conditions where militant groups such as Islamic State have been able to arise. The formation of jihadi groups now spreading throughout the region counts among the many human costs of that war.
The biggest mistake by far, although not the only mistake, the biggest mistake by far, was invading Iraq in 2003. Saddam Hussein was certainly a bad person. He had nothing to do with 9/11. He was not a terrorist. He was an evil dictator. He posed no threat to the United States of America.
The U.S. DoD budget is now over $700 billion per year for fiscal year 2019. The authorization bill calls for a base defense budget of $639 billion and an overseas contingency operations funding total of another $69 billion. The United States outpaces all other nations in military expenditures. World military spending totaled more than $1.6 trillion in 2015, and the United States accounted for 37% of that total. U.S. military expenditures are roughly the size of the next 7 largest military budgets around the world combined.
The question that I would want Americans to reflect on is, what are you getting for your money? I mean, the Pentagon budget is now approaching $800 billion a year. That's actually an undercount because it doesn't factor in things like veterans benefits. Far and away, the largest military budget on the planet. What are you getting for your money?
It is time for a bold and new change in thinking, from militarism to peace building, a paradigm shift, a bold and new approach to international relations. It's time to change from a mindset of militarism to peace building. When your only tool is a hammer, every problem starts to look like a nail, and U.S. leaders act too often like the only solution to international conflict is the military and violence. It's time to change that thinking.
People, they don't want dissent. They argue that dissent is unpatriotic, that it doesn't support the troops, but it's exactly the kind of questioning that does support the troops. If you question a prolonged war where civilians and soldiers are coming back maimed and wounded, you're supporting the troops. When you say time to rethink that, you're supporting the troops, you're supporting the entire country if you question priorities.
What Americans need to learn from, again, other alternative information sources is not just the benefits of a war, but what the costs and consequences are. So getting a sense of how many people have died as a result of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Right? It's not just the 7,000 service members who died in those 2 conflicts, right? It's an equal or even larger number of contractors for U.S. companies who went out to work with those service members. It's the million or more people who have died in both conflicts as a result, direct or indirect, of those wars. War is not inevitable. Peace is possible through these other means.
Yes, peace is possible. It may not be easy or simple, but it is possible. A nation that can put humans on the moon 50 years ago and which can create mind-boggling technology surely has the intelligence to find ways to promote peace and solve international conflict without going to war. We will be working to publicize the work of the Cost of War Project at Brown University, as well as with many other groups and individuals, to create an effective call to action multimedia project, which will include an ongoing series of mini documentary films on the costs of war, militarism, and peace building. That includes publicizing the United States Institute of Peace, which is really just a small seed that needs to grow into a larger and more effective national organization. We also recommend an outstanding book called A Mighty Case Against War by Kathy Beckwith. It provides an insightful analysis of America's past wars and ways they could have been prevented. And it provides the path to a new way of thinking and how to promote peace and stop glorifying war. We strive to spark a change in thinking about these issues, promoting peace building rather than militarism. The time is now. Join our cause. As we began with the words of President Kennedy, let us also conclude, for the insights he offered are still true today and should be heeded. As he said in his inaugural address, the torch has been passed to a new generation. We add to that. Let the new generation dedicate itself to peace as never before.
First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man. I am not referring to the absolute, infinite concept of universal peace and goodwill, of which some fantasies and fanatics dream. I do not deny the value of hopes and dreams, but we merely invite discouragement and incredulity by making that our only and immediate goal. Let us focus instead on a more practical, more attainable peace, based not on a sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution in human institutions, on a series of concrete actions and effective agreements which are in the interests of all concerned. There is no single simple key to this peace, no grand or magic formula to be adopted by one or two powers. Genuine peace must be the product of many nations, the sum of many acts. It must be dynamic, not static, changing to meet the challenge of each new generation. For peace is a process, a way of solving problems. With such a peace, there will still be quarrels and conflicting interests, as there are within families and nations. World peace, like community peace, does not require that each man love his neighbor. It requires only that they live together in mutual tolerance, submitting their disputes to a just and peaceful settlement. And history teaches us that enmities between nations, as between individuals, do not last forever. However fixed our likes and dislikes may seem, the tide of time and events will often bring surprising changes in the relations between nations and neighbors. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.